This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute and the Great Courses Plus.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 159 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. As we've heard throughout the Doing History to the Revolution series, there are many answers to the question of what caused the American Revolution. Some historians tell us that the revolution was caused by conflict and change in the social order of colonial and British society. Some say it occurred because of differences in ideas about governance and the roles that government should play in society. Still, other historians will tell us that the American Revolution happened because of the economics of the British Empire, that Great Britain dictated what goods the colonists could trade, how they could trade them, and the taxes they needed to pay on the goods they imported, all without having an actual say in Parliament. A lot of historians believe the economic factors of the American Revolution were really important, so we really need to explore them. And that's what we're going to do over the next 3 episodes. We're going to explore different aspects of the early American economy and what roles those aspects played in the American Revolution. Today's episode will help us survey the economic scene by taking us through the British North American economy on the eve of the American Revolution. Our guide for this investigation is Serena Zabin, a professor of history at Carleton College and the author of Dangerous Economies, Status and Commerce in Imperial New York. As we survey the British American economic scene, Serena reveals details about what the British Empire looked like and what it meant to be a British subject on the eve of the American Revolution, British trade networks and imperial restrictions on those networks, and information about the British imperial economy and how ordinary people participated in that economy before the outbreak of the Revolution. But first, just as a reminder, you can extend and continue your exploration of the American Revolution beyond episodes in our Doing History to the Revolution series. With the help of cultural institutions like the Library Company of Philadelphia, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Declaration Resources Project, the Omohundro Institute has been creating complementary collections of maps, images, artifacts, blog posts, book chapters, and even full-length articles from the William and Mary Quarterly, that leading journal of early American history since 1943, for each episode. You can investigate and explore all of these resources for yourself in the free OI Reader app, which is available for all your preferred Android and iOS devices. To download the OI Reader app, just visit your favorite app store or visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. Okay, are you ready to explore and possibly spend a little money in the British imperial economy of the 18th century? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. Her research interests include early American history, Atlantic history, and race and gender in American history. She's the author of the forthcoming book, tentatively titled An Intimate History of the Boston Massacre, and of the book Dangerous Economies, Status and Commerce in Imperial New York. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Serena Zabin.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you, Serena. Now, in your book, Dangerous Economies, you note that before the American Revolution, those who lived in British North America were not just colonists, but also subjects of the British Empire. Would you provide us with a picture of what the British Empire looked like on the eve of the American Revolution, and tell us what it meant to be a subject of the British Empire?
So with this book, I really wanted readers to understand that the North American colonies were not just these little isolated bits of land that were floating in some enormous remote sea. I want to explain that New York, along with all of these other colonies, was part of a much bigger world, one that was both British and actually even larger than just Britain. So I see New York as sort of a part of a commercial and a social world that included the Caribbean, especially Jamaica and Antigua, Europe, the west coast of Africa, parts of Canada. So to be a subject of this big world is different than being a citizen, which was often a citizen of a nation. So if you think about our current debates over citizenship today, for example, we know that it's a pretty restricted category. You don't just get to be a citizen because you live somewhere. But being a subject was different. The British imagined an empire in which all sorts of people were subjects. So even slaves or Native Americans. I mean, not all Native Americans, of course, necessarily considered themselves British subjects, but some did, and a lot of Britons thought that they were. So then when we think about New Yorkers, whether they were rich or they were poor or they were free or enslaved or black or white, they were all considered subjects of one empire or another. And most British subjects sort of embraced that identity. They were really resolutely, sometimes even defiantly British. So that's why I wanted us to understand that they were British subjects, not just colonists set way away from Britain.
Now, you also note that New York and its inhabitants actually sat at the edge of the British Empire. Did a Briton's place of residence impact their membership or sense of subject status? Or I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, how did the British Empire appear to those subjects who lived at its margins?
Okay, so I think that the place where one lived really did make a difference. And to a lot of people who lived on the margins, the British Empire was hardly at all on their radar screens. It was like the water you swim in, right? People never thought about themselves living in an empire. So they would do things like celebrate the king's birthday, but it was a little bit like President's Day. I mean, how much time do we really spend thinking about Lincoln or Washington on President's Day? So really, I think what being on the edge of empire did was it opened up all kinds of possibilities for New Yorkers. It creates this really fluid place in which they got all of the advantages of living on the British Empire without necessarily all of the restrictions of being in the center of it.
You know, we should look at some of these advantages and restrictions of empire. So why don't we explore the imperial British economy? One of the ways that Serena traces Americans' place and connections within the British Empire is by exploring the economy of New York City in the first two-thirds of the 18th century, and by looking at how the mundane affairs of ordinary people combined to form a large British commercial empire. Serena, would you tell us how British commercial or trade networks functioned before the Revolution? I mean, how did goods move around the world and find their way to New York City?
So trade, I'd say, was one of the two major ways that New York connected itself to the British Empire. The other one was war. So New York, it was like a central warehouse. It was a port that moved goods in and out. So New Yorkers, in some ways, were in charge of sending out two things, furs and food. That was their primary export. And the food, this was especially wheat. And then they brought in consumer goods like china and tea and sugar, and especially cloth. They loved cloth, which they referred to as dry goods. So one of the reasons that New York was such a sort of successful and important port, and New York and Philadelphia really were the two major North American ports at this moment, it was because New Yorkers became increasingly competent at handling money, financial instruments, which get complicated. But that makes it all sound really abstract when we just talk about trade networks. And so one of the things I was interested in when I was talking about mundane affairs to ordinary people were the ways that British goods and trade networks actually function through people and through their relationships. So early in the 18th century, there's this woman named Margaret Vetch who's really involved in trade. She's married to this guy who's sort of a Scottish adventurer who has this pretty, I have to say, harebrained idea about taking Nova Scotia from the French who were claiming it at that moment. So he spends his life moving around trying to find people who are going to support this crazy idea. And really, maybe not that surprisingly, he ends up going bankrupt and dying in a debtor's prison in London. and leaving Margaret without a lot of resources, except actually her family. Because meanwhile, while he's trying to get all the support to do this crazy military thing, Margaret is using her family contacts all over the British Empire to move goods around. So she imports cloth from England into New York. When she's in London with her husband, she uses her networks to get rum from the West Indies to sell it to New Yorkers. She imports wine from Southern Europe into New York. She sells spermaceti candles, which are made from whale oil, in Jamaica via an agent. So she has these family contacts that are in London for her cloth, in Boston. In Boston, they sell furs for her that she had traded with Native Americans to get. She has family in West Indies for rum. She's got people in Southern Europe, and she uses all of these personal networks. She uses her family to move these goods around the empire.
So British trade networks weren't impersonal networks where you just wrote to some stranger to send you goods. They were really personal networks where you wrote to someone you knew, like a friend or family member, to acquire goods.
Exactly. She's writing to her nephew who's saying, I don't think this is a good time to sell your candles. And she's, I don't think you know what you're talking about. Do it because I said so. Or sometimes she listens to her nephew and says, okay, maybe you're right, even though you're just a young whippersnapper. But she does use her relationships, her family. That's how she's able to move the goods. And that's how her family is able to move goods into New York, by using her.
And Margaret Vetch and her personal networks were an exception to how British Americans conducted trade, right? I mean, this was generally how trade was conducted by British North Americans.
This is how it worked for everybody, for men and women, in fact. Yes, it's all very personal. Even as trade spreads over greater and greater distances, goods continue to move along networks that are created by personal relationships.
Now, when we read about the British North American economy, we sometimes read about the restrictions on trade imposed by the Navigation Acts. Serena, would you tell us about the Navigation Acts and whether Britons living in New York or elsewhere in North America held any advantages in the face of these acts? Because they lived at the edge of the British Empire?
Yeah. So interestingly, New Yorkers really are not very fussed by the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts, there's a number of them, but they're really essentially begun in 1660 and then revised again in 1663 and a few more in 1733. 1733, there's the Molasses Act. It's part of the Navigation Acts. But for the most part, they do, I guess we could say, four things, not all of which really mattered to New Yorkers. So first, they limit imperial trade to British-owned ships whose crews were at least three-quarters British. That's a really very capacious understanding of what it means to be British. As I was saying before, lots of people could be British. Slaves could be British. Native Americans could be British. You really just have to claim subjecthood and you're British. So that wasn't that restrictive, really. And the one thing it really does, in fact, for New York is it creates a need for kind of centralized warehouses and docks and places like that that make New York really grow as an urban port, along with several other cities. So that's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is it says that certain goods, just certain goods that are being exported from the colonies, have to be sent directly to England or to Scotland. But those goods actually do not include New Yorkers' major exports, which are furs and food. So that turns out not to be a real problem for them. It's really more southern exports, tobacco, rice, indigo, stuff like that. So Parliament doesn't really care at all about food. So New Yorkers are making quite a bit of money, quite legally. And then the Navigation Act also prohibits Anglo-Americans from competing with British manufacture of certain products. And one of those things is clothing. So you can't export pre-made clothes, but you can make anything you want with the stuff that you're importing. And that's the fourth major point, is that the Navigation Acts make the colonies a kind of protected market for British goods. And one of the major goods that comes flooding into the market is cloth, especially calico that's coming from India. Wool, lots of different kinds of cloth. And New Yorkers were crazy for this stuff, lace, silk, anything really. And so they bought lots and lots and lots of cloth. That was their major import. but they bought it all legally. It wasn't a problem for them.
You just noted that New Yorkers love to consume cloth. And throughout the 18th century, North Americans participated in something called the Consumer Revolution. And one of the goods they loved to consume everywhere in British North America was cloth. So, Serena, would you tell us about the Consumer Revolution that North Americans participated in? When did this revolution begin, and how did the types of goods British North Americans consume change, over the course of the 18th century?
The Consumer Revolution is a vague historian's term. It's not one that people used at the time. That describes exactly this process that you just pointed to, the kind of ever larger amounts and variety of things. And very largely, I would say those things are china, that is to say porcelain, tea, sugar, and, as I said, cloth. And so the stuff that's being brought into the colonies in the 17th century largely focused on comfort. So, they might import glass because that provides, more and better light in a house, or pre-made bedclothes that can keep you warm while you're sleeping, right? And they also have a kind of durability that can be passed on to the next generation. But in the 18th century, as some of these goods become more accessible, and especially as people start moving around the British Empire and they're moving around the Atlantic, it's harder and harder to know who anybody is. Goods start to take on a new meaning. And that meaning is not just about comfort, but actually it's about what I call status, right? A kind of cultural meaning beyond its practical value. So you might drink tea and that would keep you warm, and that's a great stimulant. But the kind of cup you drink it out of turns out to really tell everyone who's watching you drink that tea make a big difference. So if it's served in a china cup that has a saucer is not a necessary component for drinking, right? The Chinese managed to drink their tea without a saucer. But these extra pieces of china-like saucers proclaim to the people watching you while you drink your tea that you are a person of culture and taste and refinement. So what's revolutionary about the Consumer Revolution is not just that more stuff is coming in, its meaning gets attached to these things. It's the cultural meaning that's attached to the goods that come in.
Historians often call tea a luxury good of the 18th century because North Americans used it and all its various accessories or accoutrements to convey status. And I wonder if you would tell us more about what kinds of goods the people of New York City and elsewhere in British North America really considered to be luxury goods. The goods that they bought to help convey their status in the world.
So that's really interesting. So tea becomes, and many of these goods, they start out as luxury goods, and they increasingly, as they become more and more common and more accessible, seem less and less like luxuries and more like necessities. And in between necessities, they begin as luxuries, and then they are thought of as decencies, things that you need to show that you live in a decent way. And then after that, they become ideas about necessity. So let's see. The most important of these luxury goods have to do with cloth, with the kinds of cloth that are coming in. So fashionable clothing and patterns and cloth that can be made into things that look fashionable, that rustle in certain ways, that have certain kinds of lace. The second most popular consumer goods are really groceries. So chocolate gets big at this moment, right? And sugar. And then, as we said, tea. And then all of the accoutrements around tea. So all those tea services and silver spoons, special kinds of teapots. So by the middle of the 18th century, almost everybody has at least part of a tea set, right? In fact, there are even slaves who, when they're arrested for other crimes, the courts search their belongings and say, oh, they have things that are unbecoming to their status because they too have these goods that had been considered luxury goods where now even slaves are able to get them. So one of the things that happens actually is as goods start to lose their meaning because they become so accessible, people start to worry more and more about how they use their goods. How is it that you wear your clothes? How is it you walk around? Do you know how to pour the tea? Do you know how to serve it? So the rules of behavior become more and more complex.
So luxury goods weren't really about the goods so much as about a person's behavior around those goods.
Right. The goods themselves become containers of meaning. more than they become important in and of themselves.
Now, how did Americans actually acquire the goods that they sought, like all those fancy tea sets? Would you tell us about the development of the circulating systems of exchange that the British imperial economy relied upon? Or, as you put it earlier, those financial instruments that New Yorkers became adept at using because they facilitated trade and granted New Yorkers access to an increasing number of imported goods?
So this, again, is one of these stories that sounds kind of complicated, but if we think about it in terms of people, it becomes much less complicated. So there's not a lot of actual cash that floats around the British Empire. There's a limited amount of coin and what's called specie. So there's not much in the colonies. It keeps getting pulled back into Europe. And moreover, the stuff that's still in the colonies is getting kind of shaved down and clipped, as people are trying to sort of stretch it out and make it last longer, maybe turn one coin into two. So there's some counterfeiting of coin going on here. So as there's less coin with which to do business, and because business is spreading over such enormous spaces, both the government of New York and other colonies, and also individuals decide that they need what we might call financial instruments that will help them transfer money or promises of money around. So there's two kinds. There's one kind that's called bill of exchange, which is maybe the most important piece for us, which is a private instrument. It's a little bit like writing a check. So if I were to write a check to you, Liz, on my bank, and you were to take my check and bring it to your bank, what that check really is a promise that my bank will pay your bank. And in some ways, this is how a bill of exchange worked, except there were not really banks like this. There were a couple banks, but that's not how banks worked. Instead, there were private bankers who basically held people's money, usually back in Europe. So if I were a trader in New York and I wrote a bill of exchange, I might send it to you that you would then present to my bankers in London, and they would pay you. But rarely did I actually owe the person money to whom I was writing a bill of exchange. Instead, it went through numerous other people who kept signing it over to each other, the way we might endorse a check. And the more it got signed over, the less valuable it would become, because people were like, well, I don't know, is this person trustworthy? I don't really know him or her. And so depending on how trustworthy the names were on this bill of exchange, the bill might be worth more or less. It sounds kind of complicated, but if we think of it in a more concrete set of terms, there's a man with this fabulous name who becomes the future lieutenant governor of New York, known as Cadwallader Colden. So Cadwallader Colden sends a bill to a friend and says, I would like you to use this bill of exchange that I've just sent to you to pay off the debts that I owe to our mutual friend. So he's drawn it on a group of bankers who actually, I think, become the Barclays Bank. But he doesn't write to the people at Barclays. They're just the ones who are going to see this bill after Colden's friend gives it to a third party. And so the question is, does that third party trust both Colden and his friend? And that's when it gets confusing. And maybe the bill is not worth the 50 pounds that he says it's going to be worth. His banker may not pay it out. And the other form of exchange is called a bill of credit. And those are actually put out by a government. So the colonial government of New York realizes sometimes that there's not enough money for the colony to continue to trade successfully with other colonies and with other parts of the British Empire. So they sort of create their own currency that's sometimes backed with a promise of selling land and sometimes not backed with much. And they put those out with that's called emitting. They emit these bills and people can use them as what we would call legal tender. The problem is nobody actually has to accept them. So you could have a bill of credit from New York and try and use it in Connecticut. And your friend in Connecticut might say, I'm not going to accept that, or I'm certainly not going to accept it at face value because there's no way it's backed at that value by the colony of New York. So they're not very reliable. And moreover, because every time a colony decides to put out some bills of credit, they draw new pictures of them. Right? They engrave them anew. And so nobody actually knows what they're supposed to look like. And the potential for forging and counterfeiting these bills of credit is so great that hardly anybody trusts them because most of the time they're fake.
So what I understand from all this is that reputation mattered in the 18th century Atlantic world. In fact, it was really important if you wanted people to accept your bills of exchange or possibly even your bills of credit around the empire. And I also understand that mediums of exchange, like bills of credit and bills of exchange, were just one of the many ways that local economies worked within the larger British imperial economy.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So they look like they're very impersonal, where people are passing around money that looks like checks, or they're passing around imaginary money, right? Not coins, but they're passing around pieces of paper that promise to pay. And that looks very modern and very fluid, and like that should just be accepted in the way that we're used to accepting dollars. But in fact, it depended entirely on the credibility and reputation of the people you're working with. So it turns out to be a very personal form of impersonal exchange.
So bills of credit and exchange seem to work well for wealthy merchants and people like Cadwallader Colden and Margaret Vetch, people, with standing among the British imperial mercantile and trade communities. And after we take a moment to talk about our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus, I'd like for us to explore how regular people, the non-wealthy, non-merchants of New York City and British North America, traded for and purchased goods. Today's historical adventure is brought to you by the Great Courses Plus. I love history, and I know you love it too. I mean, that's why we visit with each other each week to explore what happened in Ben Franklin's world. And just like you, I have a passion for acquiring knowledge about history, which is why I'm excited to announce that the Great Courses Plus is offering you a free month of membership to all of its on-demand video courses. When you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld, you'll find that the Great Courses Plus is your portal to dozens of courses about history, each with an expert guide. And that your free month of membership includes unlimited access to thousands of fascinating 30-minute long videos, or just their audio tracks if you prefer, that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices and even your internet-connected television. Now, one course you might really enjoy is one the Great Courses Plus partnered with the Smithsonian to make. It's called America's Founding Fathers. Within this course, you'll find a video titled Robert Morris's Money, where Professor Alan Gelzo will expand on today's episode by guiding you through the economy of the new United States and how the currency issues we've been exploring today continued on into the early Republic. So, how did Robert Morris attempt to rein in too much paper money and raise funds that would adequately finance the new United States government? Find out by visiting thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld, where you can explore America's Founding Fathers and this particular lecture about Robert Morris's money for free during your month-long trial. Again, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to sign up for your free month today. So, Serena, if wealthy men and women and merchants all use bills of credit and exchange to conduct trade, how did regular people, the non-wealthy non-merchants of New York City and British North America, trade for and purchase goods?
They do that in a couple of ways. So the most important one is there's a lot of substitutes for cash. People exchange, not surprisingly, maybe they exchange a lot of clothing. They might exchange a petticoat. We have an example of somebody actually trading a petticoat to the court in exchange for paying a bill, right? They might trade, right? They would trade in butter, or they would trade in pins or things like that. Not all of these exchanges are strictly legal, but some of them are not illegal. And then there was, as I suggested, a thriving market in counterfeit and clipped coins. And that was the other way that people who didn't have access to these bigger banks just moved money and goods around locally.
So the British Empire was this big, vast place, and yet its economy was really a highly personal space. And since it was a place driven and operated by personal relationships and reputations, I really think we should talk a bit more about the people who participated in the British imperial economy. Because when we think about all those people who protested no taxation without representation, or who stressed over the fact that they owed lots of money to British merchants for imported goods on the eve of the American Revolution, images of wealthy white men come to mind. But I really have to believe that the people who actually participated in the British imperial economy, or at least in local British American economies, must have been a more diverse group of people than those simple images would suggest.
Yeah, you're right. It really is much more complicated than those pictures of wealthy white men that we imagine. And this is true of the international British imperial economy as well as the local British American economy. So the thing about the 18th century market, this kind of early capitalist market, is in some ways, people didn't really care that much about status. There are ways in which if you were enslaved, if you were female, you're poor, people that we don't think of as your usual run of merchants, if you had a way of participating in the market, if you had something to sell or you wanted to buy, you could do that. And what's really interesting about that, I think, is that you could participate in the market. You could buy or sell regardless, in some ways, of your own social status. But the things that you bought and sold and the effects of what you bought and sold were precisely what created these distinctions of status between rich and poor, between elite and non-elite, in fact, between enslaved and free. So people could participate pretty broadly, but the effect of participating actually cut down on their then ability to act freely in an economic world.
Speaking of women as market participants, other historians have told us about coverture, the English common law custom that stripped married women of their ability to own property, money, or to make contracts. I mean, coverture meant that a married woman's legal status and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband. Serena, I know you told us all about Margaret Vetch, but what opportunities did all types of women have to participate in the British imperial economy? And in what ways did this legal custom of coverture impact their ability to participate in the consumer revolution and even in the British imperial economy?
That is such an important question because it's hard to imagine how, if you are a married white woman and you don't have what we call a legal personality, legal standing, because you're married, how you could sue for debt. And how can you participate in an economic market if you can't sue other people when they owe you money, right? So it seems as though it would be impossible for women to participate in this market. But it turns out that coverture was really not quite as complete a legal system as historians have thought that it was, and lots of other people have seen this also. But it really does turn out that women could participate either openly or somewhat less openly in this market in whichever way they wanted to. For example, one very wealthy trader, in fact, much wealthier and much more successful trader than her husband, is a woman named Mary Alexander. She has money that she inherits from her own mother, who was a very successful trader, and she becomes a major international merchant. She buys part of a ship to cut down on her import costs. She's one of the wealthiest people in New York when she dies in 1760. But even so, sometimes when her goods are shipped to her, they're shipped under her husband's name. And often we see women who are obviously suing for debt that is owed to them, but they use their husband's name in court. So they don't really have legal standing, but everybody understands that that's just a fiction. And that it is sometimes these women who are the major participants.
Now, we've been talking about how the big British imperial economy, the formal economy, if you will, how it worked during the 18th century. And although many poor and enslaved Americans participated in that formal economy, they more often than not participated in local informal economies. So, Serena, would you tell us about the informal economy of colonial New York City?
Sure. The informal economy is a sector of the economy that is not quite illegal, right? Not quite a black market, but not quite on the up and up either. And usually it is a part of the economy that people can participate in. They can trade, they can sell, they buy, that is regulated in part. So one example might say is selling alcohol. So alcohol is a regulated trade. You have to have a liquor license to sell alcohol if you sell more than a certain amount. If you sell small amounts of alcohol, you don't really need a liquor license. But you can't sell alcohol to certain kinds of people. You can't sell it to slaves. You can't sell it to apprentices. So when women who were often looking for just a little way to make money, what one historian has called an economy of makeshifts, they're just trying to find little corners of the economy that they can get into, they might sell alcohol to slaves. So it's not illegal to sell alcohol. It turns out it's just illegal to sell alcohol to people who are enslaved. So is that really completely illegal if they're selling alcohol, but some of the people they sell it to are allowed to buy it and some aren't? We don't call that exactly an illegal trade. It's not really a black market. It's an informal economy. And this economy was actually run largely by white women with a lot of help from enslaved people, often enslaved men. So enslaved men helped them find the materials that they sold. I often sold things, secondhand goods, some of which probably were stolen and people didn't look too closely at their provenance, some of which probably were not stolen or that some people might consider stolen and some not. So if you're an enslaved person and you sell your clothing, your owner might think that you have actually done something illegal because he or she may not believe that you can actually own clothing. But you probably believe that that clothing is yours, that you can sell it. So the informal economy lived in this strange gray space between legality and illegality.
And why did poor white women and enslaved men have to, more often than not, resort to participating in this informal gray economy rather than in the larger formal economy?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One is, as I suggested before, enslaved people had a hard time participating in parts of the formal economy. So there were times in which it did seem that they participated in trade, at least at a face-to-face level. We don't see major merchants who are enslaved, but we do see legal trade happening between enslaved people and free people where they might truly just be trading, and often that's okay if it doesn't involve alcohol. But there are lots of other segments of the economy in which enslaved people are not allowed to participate, and there were places they were not allowed to go. So they went to these taverns that were often being run by poor white women. So poor white women, one of the ways in which actually the city handed out poor relief was by giving poor women free peddler licenses. But the city would say, we're not going to actually give you a handout, but we will give you a break on the liquor license and you run a little shop and that's how you're going to support yourself. It's one way that they gave poor women support. So women ran these little shops and they really did sell to whomever would come in. And that tends then to make these places sort of semi-legal and semi-illegal. And they took, in exchange for liquor, which was the one thing that they were licensed to sell, they would sometimes take clothing. As I said before, there's not a lot of money floating around. Or they might take butter or other goods in exchange for the liquor. But one of the rules about slaves is that they were not allowed to exchange clothing for alcohol. And in fact, people who ran taverns were not supposed to take clothing in exchange for alcohol either, no matter who sold it to them. So then that becomes an informal economy in which these people need to work because they're not allowed to work in the larger open economy, or not fully.
So if we're looking at a map of colonial New York City, where did this informal economy take place? I mean, were these small shops in a seedy part of town, or were they just everywhere out in the open?
I think it's in between. So New York is not divided particularly at this time into really nice areas and not such nice areas. People did live big houses, small houses, buy taverns all over the place. So there would be little shops that were in alleys in between bigger houses. So they are sort of scattered everywhere. I would say it's not entirely in the open. The places where women are selling alcohol and other goods or running these little shops or shops in secondhand goods were definitely seen as seedy by their neighbors. And their neighbors often accuse them of running what they call disorderly houses, which is a big label for just something that you sort of don't like, right? It's for an environment that you think is seedy and not on the up and up, where maybe there's prostitution happening, maybe there's illegal alcohol sales, maybe there's betting, who knows? There could be lots of things happening there. It's an accusation that is not very specific. But often what it means is they think that women there are running these informal economies.
You've told us some pretty illustrative stories about the informal economy and how it worked. And I wonder if you'd tell us how we know how poor women, the enslaved, and everyday men and women participated in the formal and informal economies of British North America. I mean, what does the historical record about their participation actually look like?
It's interesting because these economies are informal. They rarely, if ever, show up in ledgers, right? In the standard place where we're going to look for economic activity. So there's not a lot of letters about them. Occasionally, we might see a woman who runs a larger shop say, oh, that she's selling some socks, or maybe somebody will take out an ad saying, I can fix holes in, your wool shirt. But for the most part, you don't see evidence of the informal economy in ledgers or in newspapers. Where you see it is in the court records, because there is the place where neighbors accuse women of running these disorderly houses. That's what they called them. And if you take the approach of these neighbors who say, oh, this house where this woman is running this little tavern has interracial socializing happening there. It has gaming. I don't really know what's going on there, but I don't think that it looks like the kind of society that I think people should be keeping. When we read those court records from the perspective of people who are either disdainful or actively hostile to poor women, then these look like criminal acts. But if we think about what is actually happening in these places that are getting labeled as disorderly houses, as actually this economy of makeshifts, this attempt for women just to make some little bit of money to be able to live, what we see is not actually criminal activity, but that's where we see this economy that's just trying to grab little bits of the corners.
Serena, given everything that you've studied and researched about the British North American and imperial economies, what role do you think these economies played in fomenting the American Revolution?
That is a good question. So I think that we see so many people participating in these early and mid 18th century economies where we see such decentralized trade, right? It's legal, at least in New York, but not much of it is running through London. We see these informal economies, which I will say never disappear, see so many small traders, and British administrators looking at places like New York understand that there's great potential there for tax revenues, right? There's a lot of exchange going on. And so new taxes might yet be able to pull from a broad base of people to make money for the British government. So if administrators actually were paying attention to these smaller and middling traders, I think they might have assumed that these new navigation taxes that start distressing so many colonists in the 1760s and 1770s as the colonies are moving towards the revolution, these taxes may have looked as though they were going to be fairly widely spread, like a cider tax in Britain. So we know, for example, that the Stamp Act falls most heavily on educated people like lawyers, newspaper people, and major merchants. But I think that other navigation acts like the Townsend Acts and other ones, and especially taxes on tea, really looked as though they were going to reach a much broader set of Americans that were less likely to push back.
Now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
The British spent so much of the 18th century at war. In fact, they waged 3 wars for empire in North America alone before the American Revolution. All 3 of those wars had European theaters, and the last war, the French and Indian War, took place all over the globe. So, Serena, In your opinion, what might have happened if the British had spent less time at war during the 18th century? What do you think its economy would have looked like, and do you think the American Revolution could have been avoided?
I really like that question. It's really interesting. I think that the war certainly created networks that moved people in and out of New York City. So I think it certainly would have changed the feel of the city. It would have changed its ability and possibly limited New Yorkers' abilities to have these widespread economic networks. And maybe most importantly, about whether or not there would have been a revolution, I really don't think there would have been one in 1776 if Britain had spent less of the previous century, less of the 18th century fighting wars. I think that the 18th century wars were absolutely fundamental to the creation of the British pride and identity that most white colonists felt. And this feeling is really strong after 1763, when, as you mentioned, the British won the 7 Years' War. They ejected the French from Canada. But even before that, wars like the War of Jenkins' Ear, right, or Queen Anne's War, these wars were part of the identity of people who lived on the edges of empire. And because those people, those colonists, felt so British, they were particularly offended and annoyed in the 1760s when they started to feel that they were being treated like second-class Britons rather than equal to any subject of the empire, when they start to feel that New York is being treated as a colonial city as opposed to a provincial city. And I think it's very largely that feeling of betrayal that fed the initial drive to independence.
Serena, before we conclude, would you tell us about your forthcoming book on the Boston Massacre?
Sure, I would love to talk about that. So I am working on a book on families and the Boston Massacre, looking at both military families and Boston families and their interactions in the months preceding and following the Boston Massacre that I think explain a lot about how people felt in the coming of the American Revolution as they have these relationships with other Britons.
And if we have questions about how the British-American economy worked on the eve of the American Revolution, where should we look for more information about how to contact you?
The best place to go is the Carleton College History Department webpage, which has some more information about me and also my email address, and you should feel free to email me at any point.
Serena Zabin, thank you for taking us through the British colonial and imperial economies on the eve of the American Revolution.
Thank you so much, Liz, for giving me a chance to talk about it.
On the eve of the American Revolution, the British North American colonies were not just remote places floating in some far-off enormous sea. They were part of the larger world of the British Empire. And as Serena just revealed, it turns out that that larger world of the British Empire was a highly connected and even seemingly small place thanks to trade networks. Trade networks in the 18th century British Empire were personal networks. As we saw with the example of Margaret Vetch, many merchants operating in British North America, as well as elsewhere in the empire, conducted trade through people they knew. After Margaret traded for beaver pelts, she sent those pelts off to a family member in Boston who would sell them for her. When she wanted to import cloth from England, she contacted a nephew based in London. And when she wanted to import rum and spermaceti candles from Jamaica, she wrote to her husband's friends and asked them to send her those goods. And these goods that Vetch traded for illustrate a larger truth of British North America on the eve of the American Revolution. It was a place full of goods. By the mid to late 18th century, British colonists in North America were no longer just striving to survive in newly settled colonies as they had been in the 17th century. They were thriving in well-established colonies, and as such, they were able to import and purchase all sorts of goods that improved their lives, and also allow them to highlight just how well they were doing to their neighbors. They developed a taste for tea and chocolate, and for goods that allowed them to enjoy their consumption of those goods. China teacups, kettles, and saucers. As Serena pointed out, colonists could have consumed tea out of any cup, or prepared it in any sort of metal pot. But those who could afford to, and the number who could afford to increased over the 18th century, those who could afford to purchase goods that improved their consumption experience. Now, over the years, Great Britain tried to regulate and raise revenue from this increased world of goods. It did this primarily through trade acts like the Navigation Acts. These acts were designed to contain as much trade as possible within the British Empire, stimulate British manufacturing, and prohibit Britons from spending money outside of the empire. If you lived in the center of the British Empire, say in the British Isles, you largely had to obey these laws because your options to skirt them were limited. But living at the edge of the British Empire, in places like New York City, Charleston, or Boston, well, that had its privileges. Living within the British Empire, but removed from its center, meant that Britons could take advantage of living in a large empire without necessarily having to deal with all the restrictions that imperial membership brought with it, like the restrictions imposed by the Navigation Acts, or even the restrictions imposed by the formal economy. People living at the edge of the British Empire, in places like British North America, had opportunities to participate in both the formal imperial economy and in informal economies, where transactions took place within the gray areas of British trade law. What did it look like to participate in the formal and informal British American economies? And how did these economies and British attempts to regulate them lead to the American Revolution? Serena gave us a sneak peek in today's episode, but these are questions that we're going to continue to explore in more depth over the next 2 episodes, when we look more specifically at the politics of tea and the practice of smuggling. Look for more information about Serena, her book Dangerous Economies, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/159. The Omohundro Institute and the Great Courses Plus made today's episode possible. Remember that you can extend your exploration of history with dozens of history course offerings from the Great Courses Plus. To take advantage of your free month of unlimited courses, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Finally, given what you know about British North America and the American Revolution, what role do you think the economy played in fomenting the American Revolution? Share your answers with me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.